Hello? Hello? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This is my second year in Omaha. There's no hummus this time. I was looking for it. Actually, just got back, this Monday from Yale University to support Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Right, to free speech, because free speech is in danger here in America, and we need to defend it. It's very unfortunate, I would say, that the Yale atheist group in university sided with the Muslim Student Association against Ayaan Hirsi Ali right to speech because she's a critic of Islam, and that's somehow going to make people uncomfortable. Who cares if she's going to make people uncomfortable? Today's speech is actually about how to defeat ISIS. It's not about the Egyptian god. I love her. But I'm talking about the new terrorist group that's showing up recently. Well, it's not recently. It's been a year so far. In Syria and Iraq. ISIS is no longer just a terrorist group. It's already a state with a caliph, a leader, called Abu Amr al-Baghdadi. Actually, yesterday at the dinner, they were putting name tags for nicknames. I put Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Some people notice who this guy is, so he's now famous. And I would like to touch on how did that happen and how to successfully counter it. Just a brief introduction about the Islamic State. They're considered extremists by Al-Qaeda. So imagine how terrible you must be to the way that Al-Qaeda considers you an extreme. The main difference between two of these terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, is pretty much a conflict of vision. It's not pretty much about ideology. Al-Qaeda is a promising establishment of an Islamic State in the future, while ISIS leadership, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who has a PhD in Islamic studies, by the way. So that sometimes whenever people say, when it comes to Ayaan Hirsi Ali event, they said, oh, Ayaan Hirsi Ali doesn't have a credentials. So I emailed Yale. I told them, why don't you invite Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi? He has some credentials to talk about the subject. And that went viral, by the way. So the conditions for this main group to exist were two, actually. The civil war in Syria, which has been going on for 4 years, and also in Iraq, which existed pretty much since the blowing up of Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra, northern Baghdad, and the rise up of the civil war. I was actually one of these people who wasn't at all surprised that something like this was going to happen. I mean, I started getting calls about, oh, tell us about the shocking news about ISIS. I was like, I'm not surprised. This was going to happen. And everybody who deals with and works in foreign policy knows that this thing was going to happen anyway. So, since the United States pulled off their troops back in 2012, former Prime Minister al-Maliki applied sectarian laws that discriminates against the Sunni minority in Iraq. Al-Maliki, who's heavily Iranian influenced, was so happy that the United States would pull off their troops without any exit strategy so he can have it all his way. And the Sunni minority have been used, that they are in power since the start of Iraq, so it really doesn't take much to piss them off. And while al-Maliki applies sectarian laws and they're already pissed off, and we get ISIS. Iraq and Syria are actually the opposite of each other in terms of majority-minority dynamics. Iraq is a Shia majority, Sunni minority, while Syria is a Sunni majority, Shia minority, even though Alawites sometimes are not really considered Shia by some Shia scholars. I mean, the idea of actually true Muslim is always confused because some Sunnis consider Shias not true Muslims and some Sunnis consider Ahmadiyya not true Muslims. So it's really very confusing. The battle of ISIS is actually a regional one, because as well as a global one. The Syrian Alawite government, Bashar al-Assad, is in alliance with two main groups, which is Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and Iran, the Islamic Republic, while ISIS is a Sunni militia mostly supported by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Now it's actually they are self-financed terrorist organization, which makes it kind of much more difficult to combat. Many of their weapons, some of them actually get smuggled through Turkey to some extent as a result of US support to the liberal fighters, Free Syrian Army. And there's actually an article published in the New York Times just in the past 2 weeks about in Qatar, they have open fundraising for ISIS. So who wants to donate? Go to PayPal and make a donation. And now it's actually the United States is making a similar mistake of supporting people that we don't really know what they actually believe in. If the United States is, in my opinion, is going to support and help the Free Syrian Army and the Free Syrian rebels, they have to make sure that they follow international laws. They're not going to be the same moderates we supported in Iraq, thinking that they were moderates, and eventually it backfired. Farid Zakaria published a very great article on the local newspaper, the Washington Post. I don't know if you're familiar with his show, GPS, on CNN. It's a very great one. The article called The Fantasy of Middle Eastern Moderates. He was talking about Senator Clinton, or probably the potential candidate for the Democratic Party in 2016, about the new conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C., about if we supported the moderates, we have probably prevented the rise of the Islamic State. And here are what the facts are. The United States has provided massive and sustained aid to the moderates in the region. The Islamic State, I'm quoting Zakaria here, the Islamic State, known as Iraq and Syria, was created in Iraq, grew out of country's internal dynamics over the past decades. The United States helped organize Iraq moderates, quote unquote, the Shia-dominated country, giving them billions of aid in dollars and training their army. But it turned out that the moderates weren't that moderate, as they became authoritarian and sectarian after the United States pulled off. Sunni opposition movements grew, and jihadi opposition groups such as ISIS gained tact and active support. For decades, since actually even the Cold War, has been always following this policy of like, well, we should support the moderates and because the extremists are just a fringe minority, and the problem is there is actually very few of them especially in this conflict. Thomas Friedman in the New York Times published an article about 2 weeks ago in which he raised 5 questions when it comes to aiming the moderate rebels. He said, can somebody please name 5 of them? Because we actually hear about there has to be moderates and they represent the majority and the minority are just a bunch of extremists. There isn't actually organized moderates. And can somebody explain, that's his second question, is why Israel, which is a country just next door to Syria, has better intelligence in Syria than anyone else, did not help the secular and moderate Syrian rebels. And how could the good Syrian rebels have triumphed in Syria when the main funders are Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which are Sunni fundamentalist monarchies that oppose the very sort of democratic, pluralistic politics in their own countries that the decent Syrian rebels aspire to build? And he said that I don't want troops in Syria more than anyone else, but I have no respect for the argument that arming the quote-unquote pro-democracy rebels would have gotten this job done. Yes, there has been a price for Obama's inaction, but there's also a price for effective action, and the critics have to be honest about it. I cannot really imagine how difficult it is to be Obama right now, because we are dealing with very internal struggle in the region. So if you're going to support you have to make sure that you're not supporting your enemies by supporting, if you're going to side against ISIS, you're helping Assad and Iran and Hezbollah, and if you fight against them, you're helping ISIS. Actually, I have a new definition for what is actually a radical Muslim and a moderate Muslim. The radical Muslims are actually the one who believe in liberal democracy and secular values, while the mainstream is actually the one that hold values that most liberals in this room disagree about. So I think we should support the radical Muslims, not the moderate Muslims. Thank you. No other example actually I can give than the Iraqi opposition to Saddam Hussein back in 2003, and they were mostly located in Washington and London. And Saddam Hussein was not a bad guy. He was a monster. Calling him a bad guy is probably a compliment. But many of his opponents prior to 2003 who were trying to lobby for the war were not actually the liberal Democrats. Most of them were al-Maliki-like people who were opposing him for merely sectarian purposes. So there's actually a term from Frederick Roosevelt. It was about they were asking him, why do you support the Nicaraguan dictator? And he said, well, he could be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And this is actually what pretty much rolls out the dynamics of politics in Iraq and in Syria, in which most of the elections have proven over and over again that the Shias are going to fight for Shia, regardless if the Sunni or the secular person was qualified and educated and everything. I'm not saying in any sense that there are no moderate Muslims or liberal Muslims, but they don't represent the majority as we think they do. I do think that ISIS does not speak for the majority of Muslims, but they're also not a minority group. We have always been stuck in we've always been stuck in the mentality that the extremists are a fringe minority, and like they're 1% and the rest is 99% who are peace-loving. That's not to say that the majority of Muslims, I have to make that clear, that extremists. But to say that extremists are a minority is a fallacy and a delusion, which I'm going to debate about today, just to keep you excited. A report on Reuters published about a year ago about the countries that atheists and other religious skeptics will be executed in. And these countries are Afghanistan, Malaysia, Maldives, Mauritania, Nigeria, Pakistan, which has nuclear weapons, by the way, Iran, which is trying to build the nuclear weapons, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Sudan, UAE, and Yemen. Can someone tell me what these countries have in common? Somebody got it right. Yes, they're all Islamic Sharia law countries. And these countries are not a minority. Let's look at the Pew research on a global divide of homosexuality. So the question was, should society accept homosexuality? So it's not about marriage equality. It's just, should we accept gay people as citizens? And these are the statistics. This is from Pew research. So the countries that said yes, Canada, US, and let's look at the English-speaking, Canada, the UK, and the US, all of them are more than 50%. Canada is 80%. UK is 77%, United States is 60%, and the percentage is growing. And we have to work. Thanks for the Human Rights Campaign. They're doing a very wonderful job. They deserve an applause for fighting for human rights. Now let's look at the Muslim world. Let's look at the statistics. These are the countries that said no, that we should not accept homosexuality. Lebanon, 80%. Turkey, which is a quote-unquote secular country, 78%. Egypt, 95%. And there's a statistic about should people, when they leave Islam, should be executed. 60% of Egypt said people who leave Islam should be executed. Jordan, 97%. Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country, 93%. And they have this case of Alexander Han, who made a tweet criticizing the Prophet, and he's now in jail, and he was beaten by mobs multiple times. You should check Michael Dodora in CFI. They're working on his case for, and Pakistan, 87%. And that's a country we're dealing with that has millions of people. And the list keeps getting worse and worse. The World Economic Forum has an annual report about the global gender gap. So it reviews 134 countries, which are part of the United Nations, succeeded in closing gaps between men and women in 4 areas, which are economic participation, opportunity, educational attainment, and political empowerment, and health and survival. These are the worst countries: Qatar, Nigeria, Algeria, Jordan, Oman, Iran, Syria, Egypt, Turkey, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Mali, Pakistan, Chad, and Yemen. These are the worst countries. The United Nations, which is the liberal place in which everybody is pretty much an accommodationist. The United Department of Economic and Social Affairs. The 7 countries with the biggest gaps between men and women are Chad, Yemen, Pakistan, which has nuclear weapons, Mali, Iraq, and Niger. When it comes to the difference between literacy rates between adult men and women, Islamic countries, once again, score the worst. Niger, Pakistan, the only 2 non-Islamic countries are the Central African Republic and Ethiopia. I can go on and on about statistics. I mean, I like math sometimes. And also, when it comes to the countries that have no female representative at all in the parliament, all of them are Muslim. Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. And the Islamic States, finally, the Islamic States fare poorly in the list of showing percentage of women making the adult labor force. In 27 countries where women accounted for less than 1/3 of the total adult labor force. 22 of them are Islamic countries out of 27. And now with the recent news about ISIS, there are people traveling from, this is the first time Iraq actually have a large number of tourists, people from 50 countries. I mean terrorists, by the way. I don't mean the tourists by New York City standards. Just like the word getting stoned means something else in Colorado than it does in the Middle East. Yeah. So look at how many people from all over coming to fight with ISIS. But how many people are there flying all over to fight against ISIS? I'll have to make clear that I support progressive, liberal, moderates all the way. But can they please stand up and fight against ISIS? There's a person that I actually admire very much. His name is Majid Nawaz. But Majid Nawaz is the exception, not the norm, because he actually admits that there is a problem. If you look at the protests, while I'm privileged to live in the District of Columbia, and we have the protests coming up all the time, and how many protests were there to protest the Israeli-Gaza conflict? Many, every day. But there are almost none. Probably from the Iraqi Christians, they protested against ISIS. But look at how much of the media coverage, Islamic media coverage about Israel killing Palestinians. The only thing they're lucky about, the thing ISIS are lucky about, they're not white or Jewish. Because if they were, most of the people would hate them. And that actually shows up the double standard of the far left in America. That if the person is white or Jewish, is doing the crime, he's a criminal. If two brown people are killing each other, that's their culture and we should respect it. These people, cultural relativists, should be ashamed of themselves, by the way. I would highly appreciate it for these moderates. It's not to convince me or my friend Al-Rizvi, we were together at the Huffington Post, or even Sam Harris and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, that Islam is a religion of peace and instead against violence. I would rather if they convince those who are actually doing the violence that Islam is a religion of peace. Which brings me to the last segment of my speech today, that the battle against ISIS and Islamic radicalism in general, we're not only fighting a group of people, but we're fighting an ideology. And that's where the difference is. Look, when we got Osama bin Laden, just a week later, we got Ayman al-Zawahiri, another leader of Al-Qaeda. And now we have ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is considered extreme by Al-Qaeda. So things are keep getting worse. And that's why we should not compare, because they always say, oh, well, here in America, we also have our own extremism. Or look what happened in Norway with Andrew Breivik. See, when Andrew Breivik committed his genocide, I don't know if you're familiar with the thing that happened in Norway of this neo-Nazi start shooting people. When this guy was jailed, there is no new movement and a new leader for the neo-Nazi movement in Norway, because we know this guy is a fringe minority. Or the same thing can be said for Jim Jones and all of the nuts, including Westboro Church. They don't really have popular support. But ISIS does to some extent. They don't have the support of all Muslims, but to deny that they have any support is a delusion. So the only way, so we're not only fighting a group of people, that means we get bin Laden and that's it, it's over, mission accomplished. That's how Bush got it wrong. But we're fighting an ideology. And in order to counter this ideology, we have to continue pushing for secular values, human rights, and democratic values. I would like to thank Omaha Atheists for doing some of that job. Thomas Jefferson, a hero of mine, said, I'm a great believer in luck, and I find the harder I work, the more I have of it. So don't sit down and expect everything to be all right. We have to work as hard as we can, whenever we can, and however we can. Otherwise, we're all doomed. In the end, the Islamic State wants to establish a global caliphate, and we have to stop them before it's too late. Thank you all for listening, and may science and reason bless you, and may science and reason bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.